Welcome to Dominican University of California and the Leadership Lecture Series in partnership with the Book Passage. I'm Christian Dean. I'm a professor of political science and humanities here at Dominican University. And this lecture series is a program of Dominican's Institute for Leadership Studies, which is a center for leadership development. This program welcomes tonight Madeleine Albright. I'd like to talk a little bit about those who have helped make this possible. Our lead sponsor for the 2017-2018 Leadership Lecture Series is Private Ocean, which is one of the oldest and largest privately held wealth management firms in Marin. Private Ocean has been named 7 times by Worth Magazine as one of the top 100 registered investment advisors nationwide. Is a 2-time recipient of the prestigious Schwab Impact Awards and is named the best wealth management firm by North Bay Biz. Alain Pinel Realtors is also supporting this evening's program as a diamond sponsor. Founded in 1990, Alain Pinel has been the leader in luxury real estate in the San Francisco Bay Area. Bank of Marin, a leading community and business bank with 23 locations throughout the Bay Area, is also supporting this evening's program as a gold sponsor. On behalf of the university, I'd like to express gratitude to Private Ocean, Alain Pinel Realtors, and Bank of Marin for their generous support of the Leadership Lecture Series. Without them, it'd be very hard to do what we do here tonight. Joining us this evening to introduce tonight's speakers is Joanne Zavlares, Vice President of Marin and Wine Country Offices of Alain Pinel. Please welcome Joanne Zavlares.
Good evening, everyone. I am honored to welcome our guest this evening, author, professor, and the 64th Secretary of State of the United States. Dr. Madeleine Albright is one of our most valued international leaders and the first woman to become the United States Secretary of State. Dr. Albright is a graduate of Wellesley College and earned a PhD from Columbia. She worked as an aide to Senator Muskie before taking a position on the National Security Council until the end of President Carter's term. Afterwards, Dr. Albright joined the faculty of Georgetown University while advising Democratic candidates on foreign policy. In 1993, Dr. Albright was appointed U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. She held that position until 1997, when she served as Secretary of State until President Clinton left office in 2001. Dr. Albright currently serves as chair of Albright Stonebridge Group and as a professor of international relations at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. In May 2012, she received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from U.S. President Barack Obama. Dr. Albright is the author of 6 New York Times bestsellers, and tonight we'll be discussing her recent book, the #1 New York Times bestseller, Fascism, A Warning. Please join me in welcoming to Dominican University our honored guest, Dr. Madeleine Albright.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Joanne, for that introduction, and thank you for telling everybody who I am, because people don't always know. So, not long ago, I was coming back from China, and Chicago was the first port of entry, and I was there getting undressed for the security people, and I put my stuff on the conveyor belt, and the lady behind me said, "So where'd you get all those screw-top bottles? My bottles all leak." I said, "Well, I got them at the Container Store." And then I was going through the magnetometer, and the TSA guard looked at me and he said, "Oh my God, it's you." He said, "I'm from Bosnia, and we all love you in Bosnia. And if it weren't for you, there wouldn't be a Bosnia, and you're welcome in Bosnia." And then he said, "Can I have a picture taken with you?" And I said, "Sure." So the line gets all screwed up, and I go back to get my stuff, and the lady of the screw-top bottle says, "So what exactly happened here?" And I said, "Well, I used to be Secretary of State." And she said, "Of Bosnia?" So, Joanne, thank you. Thank you all for being here. This is really a fantastic crowd. I want to thank Book Passage for being the sponsor of this, and this is a terrific day to be doing this because it's Independent Bookstore Day, which is just fantastic, I have to say. Yeah. And I'm very grateful to be hosted by Dominican University. I've been here before. It's a wonderful place, and so thank you so much for letting me come back. I have to say this is a great crowd, and it makes me feel young, which is important because after an event recently, a woman came up to me, and she had just heard me speak, and we were at the airport, and she said, "Madam Secretary, I want to compliment you on your speech. You spoke so clearly for somebody your age." And I didn't know whether to thank the woman or stick one of my pins into her. But to be honest, I am 80 years old, and I'm here on. I'm here on a book tour, and PBS has a name for that: Antique Roadshow. The truth is that if I hadn't been around so long, I probably wouldn't have written this book, because for me, fascism isn't just an academic theory. It had a major and direct impact on my life. As an infant in pre-World War II Czechoslovakia, I was forced by the Nazis to flee with my parents to London, where we survived the Blitz. And after the war, when we went back to Czechoslovakia, the communists drove my family from our home for a second time. Later, as UN Ambassador and Secretary of State, I had confrontations with perpetrators of ethnic cleansing in the Balkans, and I was the most senior US official so far to negotiate with a ruler from North Korea. As chairman of the National Democratic Institute, I'm involved in the struggle between democracy and dictatorship every day. And so this book is a product of personal experience. I've lived it, and I know what the stakes are. And because I didn't enter public service at a high level until I was 55 years old, it took a long time for me to find my voice. Now that I have a platform, I'm determined to use it. And I believe very strongly that in the face of despotism, silence is not a responsible option. I think we're all familiar with that slogan, if you see something, say something. Well, when I look around the world today, I see a lot happening that disturbs me deeply, and so I've adapted the slogan, see something, say something, do something. So why am I so worried? Because today, almost everywhere across the globe, democratic institutions and values are under attack. And it seems as if almost every week there's a new sham election extending the term of an autocrat as president or prime minister. It happened last month in Russia and Egypt. It happened this month in Hungary, and it will happen again next month in Venezuela. Meanwhile, in Europe, extreme nationalist movements are gaining in popularity, entering parliaments, and taking a share of power. And most disturbing of all, here in the United States, we have a president who openly scorns the building blocks of democracy. As I say in the book, and I quote myself at length, from the early stages of his campaign and right into the Oval Office, Donald Trump has spoken harshly about the institutions that make up the foundation of an open government. He has systematically degraded political discourse, shown an astonishing disregard for facts, libeled his predecessors, threatened to lock up political rivals, referred to mainstream journalists as the enemy of the American people, touted mindlessly nationalistic economic policies, vilified immigrants, and nurtured bigotry towards Muslims. To autocrats overseas, these outbursts are catnip. Instead of challenging anti-democratic forces, Trump is a comfort to them, a provider of excuses. In my travels, I hear the same questions all the time. If the American president says the press always lies, how can Vladimir Putin be faulted for making the same claim? If Trump insists that judges are biased and calls the American criminal system a laughingstock, what is to stop a repressive leader like Duterte of the Philippines from discrediting his own judiciary? And if the leaders of the world's most powerful country views life as a dog-eat-dog struggle in which no one gains except at another's cost, who will carry the banner for international cooperation at a time when the most intractable problems cannot be solved in any other way? Unquote. One of the questions I tackle in the book is, what went wrong? Why, almost 70 years after the deaths of Mussolini and Hitler, are we once again talking about fascism? Now, there are a variety of answers, but I think the explanation begins with technology. The same forces that have brought the world closer together have made many people want to cling even more tightly to their ethnic, cultural, and religious identities. Also, because of technology, a lot of good jobs have disappeared. People who feel betrayed and insecure tend to want someone, preferably an outsider, to blame. Meanwhile, the rise of social media has enabled us to share our grievances instantly and globally. This, in turn, has created an opening for predatory political movements to circulate lies that undermine democratic institutions and that violate what we used to consider the acceptable boundaries of civic debate. As a result, bigoted speech is heard more and more often, and there's an increase in hate crimes, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism. Then, when you add to this toxic mix the arrival of political leaders who promise easy answers, who exploit social divisions for their own purposes, who utter falsehoods with every breath, and who are skilled communicators, you can follow the trail to where we are today. So this leads to the question, what can we do about it? And there are a lot of elements to this, but I would like to begin with 5 principles. First, defend the truth. A free press, for example, is not the enemy of the American people. It is the invention of the American people. Second, reinforce the doctrine that no one, not even the President of the United States, is above the law. Third, be an active participant in the democratic process, whether by running for office or advocating Is Trump screwing up with my microphone here? In the democratic process, whether by running for office or advocating electoral reforms, or helping to register new voters, or knocking on doors for favored candidates. There are a multitude of ways to be a good democratic citizen. Fourth, listen respectfully to those with whom you disagree, because we're not going to get anywhere without dialogue. Mr. Trump would like to divide our population into us and them, but the first word of our Constitution is we. Finally, we should take our cue from the young people we saw marching a few weeks ago on behalf of gun sanity. Now, I may be getting on in years, but I can still be inspired when I see children coming together to demand the right to study without having to wear a flak jacket. The cynics will tell you that there's nothing to be done about the democratic crisis we find ourselves in today. But as Nelson Mandela said, everything is impossible until you do it. So on that note, I'd like to conclude my opening comments. But before I open the floor to your questions, I wanted to go through the way I end this book in terms of trying to get us to answer a few questions. In my 20-plus years as professor, I have learned to ask myself when I'm not getting good answers, whether it is because I haven't been looking in the right places. And I wonder now whether we as democratic citizens have been failing to form the right questions. And perhaps we should begin by asking what our prospective leaders want us to think and feel. So do they cater to our prejudices by suggesting that we treat people outside our ethnicity, race, creed, or party as unworthy of respect? Do they want us to nurture our anger toward those whom we believe have done us wrong? Do they encourage us to have contempt for our governing institutions, the independent media, and the courts? Do they go beyond asking for our votes to brag about their ability to solve all problems and satisfy every desire? Do they solicit our cheers by speaking casually and with pumped-up machismo about using violence to blow enemies away? Do they echo the attitude of Mussolini, which is the crowd doesn't have to know, all it has to do is believe and submit to being shaped? Or do they invite us to join with them to build and maintain a healthy center for our societies, a place where rights and duties are apportioned fairly and all have room to dream and grow? To answer these questions will not tell us whether a prospective leader is left or right-wing, conservative or liberal, or in the American context, Democrat or Republican. However, they will tell us much that we need to know about those wanting to lead us, and much also about ourselves. For those who cherish freedom, the answers will provide grounds for reassurance or a warning we dare not ignore. So now I'm very happy to turn to your questions and have a good discussion. Thank you so much.
But I have never seen so many questions on the same subject, which is, when did you start collecting pins? Where do you get them? And what is the one you have on tonight?
Okay, so let me say how I clearly like jewelry. And when I went to the United Nations in 1993, it was the end of the Gulf War. And the ceasefire had been translated into a series of sanctions resolutions. And I was an instructed ambassador. And so my instructions were to make sure the sanctions stayed on, which meant that I said perfectly terrible things about Saddam Hussein constantly. He deserved it. He'd invaded Kuwait. So all of a sudden, there was a poem in the papers in Baghdad comparing me to many things, but among them, an unparalleled serpent. So I had a snake pin, and I started wearing it whenever we talked about Iraq. And I think some of you have noticed how, in fact, the ambassadors after a Security Council meeting go out and meet with the press, and all of a sudden the camera focuses and the reporter says, "Why are you wearing that snake pin?" And I said, because Saddam Hussein compared me to an unparalleled serpent. And then I thought, well, this is fun. And I went out and I bought a lot of costume jewelry to depict whatever I thought we were going to do on any given day. So on good days, I wore flowers and butterflies and balloons. And on bad days, I wore a lot of spiders and carnivorous animals. And when the other ambassadors said, "What are we going to do today?" I don't know if you remember, but the first President Bush had said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." So I said, "Read my pins." And that's how the whole thing started. And people got used to it. As a matter of fact, there was a time the Russians were bugging the State Department, and we found the man sitting outside listening. So we did what diplomats do, which was to complain to Moscow. But the next time I met with the Russian foreign minister, I wore this huge bug, and he knew exactly what I was saying.
Fantastic.
I could add to that something. Let me just say, pins got me into trouble, and they got me out of trouble. So there was a in the 50th anniversary of NATO, there was this crazy picture of President Clinton, Secretary of Defense Bill Cohen, and I sitting on a sofa in the green room, and we did the hear no evil, see no evil monkey thing. We looked like crazy people, and it ended up in Time magazine. So then I went to Moscow. We went to Moscow to prepare for a summit in the summer of 2000. And I had managed to find 3 monkey pins. And we're walking in, and President Putin says to President Clinton, "We always notice what pins Secretary Albright wears. Why are you wearing those monkeys?" And I actually said, "Because I think your policy in Chechnya is evil." And he got furious at me. Rightfully so. And President Clinton looks at me like, "Are you out of your mind? You're supposed to be the chief diplomat, and you've just screwed up the summit." So that's when they got me into trouble, but they also got me out of trouble, which is I actually invented the art of diplomatic kissing. That is until Macron and Trump got, and so and it's much harder than meets the eye because the Latin, some kiss on the right cheek, some on the left, so a lot of bump noses, and the French kiss twice, and the Dutch 3 times, and then there was Yasser Arafat, just the thought, right? Anyway, so I go to South Korea, and I have a meeting with the South Korean foreign minister. I get there, we have a nice embrace, and then I leave, and all of a sudden I get a call from a press person, a journalist, saying, "Don't you think the foreign minister should be fired for what he said about you?" And I said, "Well, what did he say?" And he said, "Well, I love it when Secretary Albright comes because we're about the same age, and I'm this tired old man. And when we embrace, she has very firm breasts. So what do you have to say about that?" And I said, "I have to have something to put those pins on." So the pin I'm wearing today is Mercury the Messenger, which I think fits very well with this book. So thank you.
You mentioned Korea, and I have a number of questions from the audience about Korea, about what is going on right now, about the diplomatic situation, about the fact that our new Secretary of State went to North Korea before he was Secretary of State. Could you give us your thoughts?
Yes, and let me just say, I am very glad that there are diplomatic talks beginning because ultimately I do think that that is the way to go. I'd say I teach a course at Georgetown, and I say foreign policy is just trying to get some country to do what you want. That's all it's in. So what are the tools? And the course I teach is the National Security Toolbox. And diplomacy is the basic tool, and it's not a gift. It is the way you talk to people that you actually disagree with, trying to figure out how you can solve a problem. So I'm glad it's gone in that direction. Our relationship with North Korea has been unbelievably complicated, and it obviously began with the Korean War, and there has never been a peace treaty when that war ended in 1953. And so the division of the Korean Peninsula has been something that has been very troubling for all of us, plus then the development more and more of they are trying to develop and work on getting more nuclear material. And it was something that actually we tried to deal with in the Clinton administration when they pulled out, the North Koreans threatened to pull out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I won't go through the whole history, but I can assure you that we spent an awful lot of time on this with a lot of diplomatic preparation. So then, in the summer of 2000, President Clinton in '99 had asked former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry to do a complete review of our North Korean policy. And he spent time on it. He also kind of said, this is the fork in the road time. And he went to Pyongyang and said to the North Koreans, these are the issues out there. We can either negotiate or we will use force. And they chose to negotiate. So then later, more kind of early fall, the number 2 guy from North Korea came to the United States, and he and I went to the Oval Office, and he gave President Clinton an invitation for him to go to North Korea. And President Clinton did, I believe, the right thing, say it could be that I will go, but first I'm going to send the Secretary of State. And so I was there, and I spent a lot of time in North Korea. And interestingly enough, there are some similarities to what's going on now. The president of South Korea at the time was Kim Dae-jung, who really wanted to, he had something called the Sunshine Policy, and he also wanted to figure out how to have a different relationship with North Korea. We had very little information about Kim Jong-il, the father of the current guy. The intelligence I was given was that he was crazy and a pervert. He was not crazy. So I get there, and we have no embassy there, and I'm stuck in the guest house, and they had cameras and listening devices. And then I was told that even as you're typing on a laptop, they can tell by the strokes what you're saying. So we sat there waiting, and all of a sudden I get a message saying that I had to go and see his embalmed father in the mausoleum. So more complicated than meets the eye, because if you bow too low, then the American press thinks you're being obsequious. And if you don't bow low enough, you haven't accomplished anything. So I must have had the right angle, because then all of a sudden I was summoned to a press conference with the dear leader. And we're there at this press conference that was something out of the 50s, and I'm standing next to him, and I see we're the same height. And I knew I had on high heels, and then I looked over at him, and he had on high heels. And his hair was a lot poofier than mine. But I have to say that we had very detailed technical talks about them limiting their ballistic missile capability. And we were all set in terms of continuing our negotiations. In fact, they were beginning to take place in Malaysia when the election of 2000 happened. And that was hard to explain to some Americans, much less to North Koreans. And so I briefed Colin Powell, who was the Secretary of State designate, and he wanted to carry on what we were doing. Because when I left, the North Koreans had fissile material only maybe for 1 nuclear or 2 nuclear weapons. They had no nuclear weapons, and they had no ballistic missiles. And General Secretary Powell was prepared to continue, and then there was a headline in the Washington Post that said, Powell to continue Clinton policies on North Korea. He was hauled into the Oval Office and told no way. So we could have been doing all this for the last 20 years. And the bottom line is that I think it's important for these talks to go forward, but I warn about the amount of preparation that has to take place. And if, in fact, there is a meeting between President Trump and Kim Jong-un, it is just the beginning of something, and it's going to take a lot of diplomacy. And the problem is we don't have a lot of diplomats at the moment. It takes diplomats to do diplomacy. So I think I'm glad they're having the talks, and I think the meetings between the two leaders of North and South yesterday was very interesting, but it's just the beginning of something. Sorry to have taken so long.
No, you haven't. You've given us a lot of depth.
Yeah.
Someone in the audience comes from Hungary, or at least relatives do, and is very concerned about what's going on in Hungary and asks about this term that we hear, illiberal democracy. What is that?
An oxymoron. Let me just say, and I do write about Hungary in the book, and I have spent most of my life studying what happened in Central and Eastern Europe under communism, and Hungary was a remarkable country as it tried very hard after the Soviet invasion in 1956 to really keep some form of freedom and to keep fighting against what was going on, pressure from the Soviet Union. And one of the most remarkable people, I was there in the middle 80s, was Viktor Orban, who was this kind of incredibly charismatic young leader who was a star dissident, and he was everybody's favorite, and he started a party called Fidesz of young people. And believe it or not, he is now, having just had another election as prime minister, he has acquired so much power that he has undercut all the good things that were happening in Hungary in the 80s and some of the 90s. And it's really a sign of somebody wanting to accumulate personal power. He also has done something else, which is what I alluded to in my remarks. Something very dangerous is creating an us versus them in terms of only Hungarians can be in Hungary. And so he's against the migrants that have come in. He's using them as a scapegoat for things that are going wrong. And he is also awakening anti-Semitism. He has been opposed to George Soros, who is a Hungarian refugee and Jewish. He somehow has forgotten that George Soros funded his education at Oxford. And so and he's coined this term illiberal democracy, which really makes no sense. It is an accumulation of power, and this is the thing to be careful of. When people with fascist tendencies use the word democracy and some of the various institutions of democracy to undermine democracy. And so it is very dangerous what's going on, and he's had influence not only in Hungary, but in Poland, where there also is now an authoritarian leader who is playing off of the ethnic card. So I'm very troubled, and I do specifically talk about Hungary in the book.
While we're on Hungary and Europe,
Yeah.
let's move to Turkey. Someone has asked about the so-called democracy in Turkey.
Yeah. Well, let me just say, and I think it's worth, in terms of looking at those countries as well as Poland and generally what I see as part of the issue, there is no question that every society has divisions. And there are divisions, some based on social status, some on the economy, and there are people in various societies that are dissatisfied. The question is whether the leaders try to find some kind of common answers, or do they exacerbate the differences? And that is one of the common themes that I write about in the book, and it really began with Mussolini and Hitler, but Turkey is a very interesting example of this. I have considered myself for a large part of my life as a Turkophile. I find it a fascinating country. I have visited a number of times, and I went there when I was in office and since. But what happened was Turkey was actually run by, they had some military coups, and then some people that kind of were the fancy people that lived on the other side of the Bosporus in Istanbul, and not enough connection with the people. And so a new party was created there, the AKP, that Erdogan and this man Gulen had founded together. And what happened was that Erdogan won elections fair and square, partially because his party did constituency services, and he cared about people that lived in the rural areas, in the hinterland. So then what happens is he's the one that this personal power trip happened, and he has accumulated more and more power. I must say that I place some blame on the way that the Europeans looked at Turkey. They didn't want to bring them into the EU, and there were people that were dissatisfied, and what he did, again, was exacerbate the differences. He is now, I think, doing the worst things in terms of arresting journalists, discriminating against people, Kurds, who are part of Turkey, and then fighting the Kurds that are now in Syria. So it is a very dangerous situation, and they are NATO members. They are also buying arms from Russia, and I think it's one of the more complicated issues we have to deal with. But again, it is a leader who comes to power because there is dissatisfaction, then exacerbates the divisions between it's an us-them thing, and then wants ethnic purity and blames outsiders for it.
So there's somebody who has asked, these leaders, they all seem to get first democratically elected. What happens after that?
Well, let me just say what I find interesting, because the book has an awful lot of history in it, and I do go back. The first fascist was Mussolini, and he was somebody that came as a result of divisions, etc., in Italian society, and he got power constitutionally. King Emmanuel transferred power to him, and he was somebody that began to see what it was like to accumulate power slowly. And I think the most descriptive quote I have in the whole book is what he said, which is, if you pluck the chicken one feather at a time, people don't notice. And I think that that is something that we all have to keep in mind. And so then what happens is Hitler comes, and Hitler takes it to a whole other level. But he also came into power constitutionally. Hindenburg transferred power to him. And then he went a whole step further in terms of blaming the Jews for everything. You need a scapegoat. And that's one of the things that happens. is there are problems that continue in the society, and instead of, and recognizing that the simplistic slogans that a dictator puts out don't work, they then have to find somebody to blame. And so that's what happens, and there is a deepening of the divisions between the us and the them. There is this hunger for personal power, and then one of the things I have basically looked at, Hungary and Poland and Turkey, the Philippines and Venezuela, and the chicken is being plucked one feather at a time. Now, I was going to write this book no matter what happened in our election, because I saw, as I travel around the country a lot, that we have divisions in our country. And the question is whether our leaders are trying to find some common way to solve it, or do they exacerbate the differences, and whether they pluck one feather at a time.
That brings us to a question that several people have asked, and that is the attack on the press. And as one person put it, it feels like every day the press is being attacked, and yet it is the press that is telling us what is going on.
Well, I think that, let me just make something very clear, because I'm often asked this, and it's just better to get it out right away. I am not calling President Trump a fascist. I think he is the most undemocratic president in modern American history, and part of it has to do with this question in terms of the way the press is treated. I have spent my academic life looking at the role of information in political change, and information is power. And it's important in a democracy for the people to be able to be provided with a press that doesn't have every story exactly the same, but are trying to find the facts and provide information. It is absolutely essential to the freedom of our democracy. I think the constant attacks on the press and the glorification of one channel, I think, is a generally horrible problem. Journalists are being attacked all the time. This is what America is about, freedom of the press. And I think when I've got my to-do list, by the way, and my to-do list begins with all of us defending the freedom of the press and saying they are not the enemy, they are the source of information that makes citizens be able to carry out our obligations.
There are a number of young people in the audience, including one person who is about to go to your alma mater, Wellesley, but all of their questions seem to be about what can we do sometimes it, as one person on her card said, sometimes it feels so overwhelming, I can't do anything.
Well, first of all, I went to Wellesley sometime between the invention of the iPad and the discovery of fire. Yeah, so slightly different. But let me say, I do teach, and I am both impressed and worried about what's going on. People often ask me if I'm an optimist or a pessimist. I'm an optimist who worries a lot. And because I do think that the younger generation is very well educated, and a lot of them have speak different languages, and they've traveled abroad, and they have a lot of experiences. But some of them kind of think that their vote and their interest doesn't matter, that we'll wait this out. The last thing we need to do is to normalize what's going on now. Something is really wrong, and what we really need are the young people to be actively involved and to move forward and get involved. I hope run themselves or support people or go out and register voters. And one of the things that I think we need to remember is that, as here at this great university, people study political philosophy. The bottom line is the social contract is broken. And the social contract is based on the idea that people give up some individual rights in order to be protected by the state or have the state build roads or provide help in education. But the other side is the responsibility of the citizens. And I am chairman of the board of the National Democratic Institute. I travel abroad and observe elections all the time. And there are people that stand in the rain and the heat in order to have the privilege of voting. And here there are too many people that don't vote. So I really do think young people especially need to get out there and do something. And by the way, there isn't a speech or a book that's ever written that doesn't quote Robert Frost. So the bottom line is, Robert Frost said, the older he gets, the younger are his teachers. And I believe that now, and those young kids that marched in Washington, all over, are the ones they're leading us, and we need to help them to be able to get ready for the next generation. And so I'm for the young people getting out there. Right.
And speaking of young people, there are probably some dreamers in this audience, because I know there are dreamers at Dominican. And a couple of people said immigration is something that is so scary right now. What can you tell us?
Well, first of all, this is something that I feel very personally. I'm a naturalized American. And by the way, the first person to call me when I was named Secretary of State was Henry Kissinger. And he said, Madeleine, you have taken away my one unique characteristic of being an immigrant Secretary of State. And I said, no, Henry, I don't have an accent. So, but I do think, and then he also said, welcome to the fraternity. I said, it's not a fraternity anymore. But I am going to take a little, for me, let me just say, I said that we had to leave our country twice. And my father said the following thing, that when we were in England, when Hitler had taken over, people were very kind to us. And they said, we're so sorry your country's been taken over by a terrible dictator. You're welcome here. What can we do to help you? And when are you going home? When we came to the United States after the communists took over, we got here and people said, we're so sorry your country's been taken over by a terrible system. You're welcome here. What can we do to help you? And when will you become a citizen? And that is what America is about. And I do think that I am appalled by what is happening. Every country has a right to have its immigration policy. There's no question about that. And I hope that there is one that really is developed. But it cannot be what is going on now, where people are banned from coming in because of their religion, and the immigrants and refugees are made to look like terrorists and rapists and robbers, and we are operating on the basis of the fear factor. And one of the things that I've been looking at in other countries that bothers me, and we're seeing here, is when you blame the other. That is the scapegoat aspect of it. And so I think this is one of the more dangerous things that's going on. And the dreamers are children that were brought over. They are as American as any of us. And I think that I'm quite outraged. And let me just say, I was naturalized between my sophomore and junior year at Wellesley. And one of the things that I love to do is to participate in naturalization ceremonies. And so the first time I did it was on July 4th, 2000 at Monticello. I, after all, had Thomas Jefferson's job. And so I went, and I can't swear people in because I'm not an officer of the law, but I can give them their certificate. So I was doing that, and all of a sudden I hear this man say, can you believe it? I'm a refugee, and I just got my naturalization certificate from the Secretary of State. And I went up to him and I said, can you believe that a refugee is Secretary of State? That is what our country is about.
And speaking of Secretary of State, could you tell us a little bit about your television career, particularly on Madam Secretary?
Well, I have a fairly extensive television career. This all began when I left office, and I get a call from the producer of the Gilmore Girls. And they said, would I mind if somebody played me? And I said, yes, I mind. I want to play myself. So I started, and I was on Gilmore Girls. And my daughters called me and said, Mom, you weren't acting, you were just playing yourself with my. So then my second big television moment was on Parks and Recreation. So what happened was Amy Poehler said that one of the scenes there, she had a picture of me on her desk, and somebody came in to ask her for a date, and they said, is that your grandmother? And she said, if you don't know who Madeleine Albright is, I don't want to go out with you. Anyway, no. So I went on that, and that was fun. And then this is what happened on Madam Sec. By the way, I persuade myself that watching television and various shows is actually very important because you learn about issues and how they are dealt with. So I used to watch Army Wives and various things. So that's my rationalization for all this. Anyway, so I get a call from Leone saying she wanted to have a meeting with me to find out what it was like to be Secretary of State. So we are having breakfast, and I'm having this really serious conversation with her, and I thought, really? Why am I doing this? And then the writers came over, and they wanted to talk to me. And I really think they bring up a lot of great issues. So what happened then, and by the way, then I did an episode on Madam Secretary, and the truth is, I can do many things, but I couldn't do it full time. It took 5 hours to film something that was that long. But tonight, actually, in Washington, there is this crazy thing called the White House Correspondents' Dinner. And so about 3 years ago, CBS and the crew of Madam Secretary asked me to come be their guest. So we walk in, and every time somebody said Madam Secretary, Leone would turn around. So that is my... But it's fun to do TV. I have a whole other life. I played the drums with Chris Bodie at the Kennedy Center. I like to have a good time. Yeah.
You are pretty active on Twitter, and some of your tweets are incredible. Would you mind repeating the tweet you did about President Macron of France visiting?
Well, I can't repeat it word for word, but I basically said it was very nice to hear that kind of a speech in terms of what America's responsibilities were from a president to Congress. And it was about time that we had that kind of a speech. Yeah.
I'm sorry, that was my question.
Yeah.
But in the questions from the audience, there are several about the fake news, the Facebook, the web. Where do we go now? We have a new election about to happen. How do we know what we're looking at?
Well, let me just say, I think that I mentioned that I've always had this interest in the role of information in political change, and there always is some new invention, whether it's the printing press, or I wrote a book about the Polish press, and at that stage, the new invention was the microcassette, and Lech Wałęsa, the leader, would speak in one factory, and then they'd send it to another one. So there's always something new going on. I do think that what has happened with technology is remarkable, and it's a double-edged sword. There's no question about that. And I think that it has obviously brought us much closer together, but at the same time, disaggregated voices, and we're never quite sure where the information is coming from. And I think that one of the things that has to happen is to be more open about what's happening and have the private sector and the government try to figure out how we manage with what is the newest thing in terms of innovation and is very positive, as well as the problems that are there. I also think that I have spent a lot of time, again, to go back to my National Democratic Institute life, trying to figure out the role that social media played in the Arab Spring, for instance. And so it was social media that got people in Cairo to Tahrir Square, but then elections were held too soon, and the Muslim Brotherhood won because the people that had been gathered in Tahrir Square, in fact, had all gotten, they were in their own little echo chamber, and their voices were disaggregated. And then I made up this mythical man that wanted to come into Cairo to open his stall in the marketplace, and Cairo was a mess, and he said, I want order, which is when General Sisi came in. And then I stole this line from having been in Silicon Valley not long ago. It's just purely plagiarized, but it really explains a lot of things, which is people are talking to their governments on 21st century technology. The governments listen to them on 20th century technology and are providing 19th century responses. So we need to figure out what this incredible new innovation is and make it something that there's also paradoxes. People put everything about themselves on Facebook and then are mad that people know anything about them. So I think we need to take some responsibility, but it is the innovation of our day, and I think there has to be some action, how not to limit freedom of speech, and at the same time, not allow damage. And there's no question. I happen to think that what the Russians are, we have to remember that we're dealing with a KGB officer. He knows exactly how to use propaganda and militarize information. And I believe that the Russians did have some effect on our last election and that they're getting ready to try to do it in this one. And so I think we have to push back and get some way to make sure that our machines, our voting machines aren't hacked, that there's not a lot of stuff going on that is undermining our democracy.
Could you just quickly, several people have asked, what is fascism? What is nationalism? It's confusing, and I will say, all of you have the book and you're going to find out, but could you touch on it a little bit?
Well, let me say, it is difficult to define, and it's a term that's just kind of thrown around. If you are talking to somebody and they disagree with you, you say they're a fascist. Or if a teenage boy doesn't get the car, he calls his parents a fascist. So I think we have to be very careful about how we define it. I think what it is this, it begins with this tribalism, that the leader identifies himself with a tribal nationalistic group against others, so that it automatically begins to divide. As I said, there were divisions, but exacerbates them, and so it's that nationalist aspect. By the way, I think patriotism is terrific. Nationalism is very dangerous, because if my identity hates your identity, then it really creates these great chasms. Then in addition to that, a fascist will also make sure that the them have no individual rights at all. So it all goes to this tribal group that is there. There also is this derogation of the press, as I said, and making sure that there is no freedom of the press, undermining the institutions, especially the judiciary, in terms of saying that ex-judge can't do the job, or as the polls have done in lowering the power of the judiciary. It also then is using propaganda and public rallies to turn people against each other, and even allowing violence or pushing violence. If there's a fight that begins at the rally, then you say, go for it. And then also the lack of any civil discussion about anything. And so it's mostly accumulating the power, and a fascist dictator is somebody who does this us versus them, who has no respect for the individual rights of those he disagrees with, and is willing to use anything to gain power, a bully with an army. But it is hard to define, but it is very much carried out by plucking one feather at a time.
I have one other question that 4 people asked. When will we ever have a woman president?
Well, we had one. She was actually elected. But let me say, I am very encouraged by the fact of how many women are now running for office across the board, at local level and higher up. And I think that It's very important to what they believe in and how it works, so I hope to see it. By the way, I'm often asked if the world would be better if it were only run by women. If you think that, you've forgotten high school. So the bottom line is, I do think that we need to have good co-ed leadership, but I would like to see, we always think we're number one in everything. There are countries that have and have now currently women leaders, so we need to get there ourselves. Yeah.
Secretary Albright, you've inspired us, you've informed us, you've written an amazing book that had to be written, and it's also beautifully written, and there are times when I found myself laughing. How can you laugh about fascism? Yeah. Only she could make you laugh. Yeah. But you could hear tonight why. So thank you for all you've done for this country and the world, and we feel very lucky.
And thank you all for being here. And Elaine, thank you. And thank you for your help. Thank you so much for your kind words.